The flickering candlelight cast dancing shadows across the ancient parchment as Father Giuseppe Martinelli's trembling hands held what would either vindicate or destroy 2,000 years of Catholic doctrine. Deep within the Vatican's secret archives, surrounded by miles of forbidden knowledge, he had stumbled upon a 4th-century manuscript that would shake the very foundations of Christianity. The ink, tested and authenticated, bore witness to a debate so fierce it had split the early church down the middle. The question written in faded Greek letters seemed to burn through the yellowed papyrus. Was the Mother of Christ truly ever virgin? What Father Martinelli couldn't have known was that this single document would reignite a theological war that had been smoldering for nearly 2 millennia, threatening to expose the human politics behind divine truth. The story begins not with Mary herself, but with the earth-shattering moment when an angel appeared to a young Jewish maiden in 1st-century Palestine. The Gospel of Matthew records the impossible, a virgin conceived without human intervention. Luke's account amplifies the miracle, describing Mary's bewildered question to the heavenly messenger. But here lies the first crack in Christianity's foundation. Either Gospel writer actually uses the word virgin in the original text. They employ the Greek term parthenos, which could mean virgin, but also simply young unmarried woman. This linguistic ambiguity would later become the battlefield where theological empires rose and fell. The early Christians, desperate to distinguish their Messiah from pagan gods born of sexual unions, seized upon the virginal birth as proof of Christ's divine nature. Yet questions lingered like shadows in the corners of their minds. The first 3 centuries of Christianity witnessed a gradual transformation of Mary from a humble peasant girl into an object of veneration approaching worship. Church fathers like Justin Martyr and Irenaeus began developing the doctrine of perpetual virginity, the belief that Mary remained a virgin not just before Christ's birth, but during and after as well. Their motivations weren't purely theological. In a Greco-Roman world where female sexuality was viewed with suspicion and celibacy was prized as the highest spiritual state, an ever-virgin Mary became the perfect symbol of Christian purity. These early theologians crafted intricate arguments about Mary's virginity in part 2, remaining physically intact even during childbirth. They described Christ's birth as light passing through glass, leaving no trace of human biology. But beneath these poetic metaphors lay a disturbing question: why did the Church feel compelled to deny Mary's full humanity? The opposition emerged in the 4th century through a Roman Christian named Helvidius, whose challenge would echo through the ages. With devastating simplicity, he pointed to the Gospel references to Jesus's brothers and sisters, James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas, along with unnamed sisters. If Mary remained perpetually virgin, Helvidius argued, where did these siblings originate? His logic was unassailable: either the Gospels lied, or Mary bore other children after Jesus. The implications terrified church leadership. If Mary experienced normal marital relations with Joseph, if she bore children through natural means, then her exalted status as the new Eve, the perfect vessel of God, would crumble. The entire edifice of Marian devotion, already taking root in Christian worship, would collapse. Helvidius wasn't merely questioning doctrine, he was attacking the psychological foundation upon which millions of believers had constructed their faith. The Church's response would be swift, brutal, and decisive. Enter Jerome, the brilliant and notoriously sharp-tongued biblical scholar whose translation of the Bible into Latin would define Western Christianity for over a millennium. Jerome's assault on Helvidius wasn't merely academic, it was personal, vicious, and strategically calculated to destroy any opposition to perpetual virginity. In his treatise against Helvidius, Jerome deployed every weapon in his intellectual arsenal. He reinterpreted the brothers and sisters as cousins or children from Joseph's previous marriage, despite no biblical evidence supporting either theory. He argued that the word until, in Matthew's phrase, knew her not until she had brought forth her firstborn son, didn't imply subsequent relations, using tortured linguistic gymnastics that would make modern scholars cringe. But Jerome's most revealing argument exposed the true stakes. Preserving Mary's virginity was essential to maintaining her role as the perfect Christian woman, the model all believers should emulate. His subtext was unmistakable: female sexuality, even within marriage, somehow diminished spiritual purity. The cultural context surrounding this debate reveals Christianity's complex relationship with human sexuality and women's roles. The early church emerged in a world where various philosophical and religious movements promoted celibacy as spiritually superior to marriage. Gnostic traditions viewed matter and flesh as inherently evil, while Neoplatonic philosophy prized the soul's escape from bodily constraints. Christianity absorbed these influences, gradually developing a theology that elevated virginity above matrimony. Mary's perpetual virginity became the theological linchpin supporting clerical celibacy, monastic movements, and the Church's increasing emphasis on sexual purity. But this elevation came at a cost. It created an impossible standard for ordinary Christian women, who could never achieve Mary's unique status as Virgin Mother. The doctrine simultaneously exalted and marginalized womankind, creating psychological tensions that persist to this day. Early Christian art began depicting Mary with increasingly ethereal features, removing her from recognizable humanity and transforming her into an otherworldly figure who bore little resemblance to a first-century Jewish woman. Yet hidden beneath the theological arguments lay darker motivations that few dare examine. The Church's insistence on Mary's perpetual virginity served multiple political purposes that had little to do with biblical truth. First, it provided justification for the celibacy requirements that would eventually be imposed on all clergy, creating a separate priestly caste divorced from normal family life. Second, it reinforced patriarchal control by establishing male celibate theologians as the ultimate interpreters of female experience and sexuality. Third, it created a powerful tool for suppressing any form of Christianity that honored the sacred feminine or acknowledged sexual experience as part of spiritual life. The Gnostic Gospels, many of which portrayed Mary Magdalene rather than the Virgin Mary as Jesus' closest companion, were systematically destroyed or hidden. Alternative Christian communities that celebrated married clergy and recognized women's spiritual authority were branded heretical. The debate over Mary's virginity wasn't really about historical accuracy. It was about power, control, and the Church's determination to shape human sexuality according to its institutional needs. The psychological impact of perpetual virginity doctrine extended far beyond theological seminars into the daily lives of millions of believers. Christian women found themselves trapped between two impossible ideals. They could never achieve Mary's virginal purity, yet they were expected to emulate her perfection. Marriage became a spiritual compromise, a necessary evil for procreation rather than a celebration of human love and intimacy. Mothers who had experienced the pain and messiness of actual childbirth struggled to relate to a Mary who supposedly gave birth painlessly, leaving her body unmarked by the experience. Children grew up with distorted views of sexuality, learning that even within marriage, physical intimacy carried spiritual danger. The doctrine created generations of believers wrestling with shame, guilt, and confusion about their most fundamental human experiences. Yet questioning Mary's perpetual virginity remained dangerous, potentially heretical territory that few Christians dared explore. The very human woman who had said yes to God's mysterious plan became an untouchable icon whose humanity was systematically erased. As the 4th century progressed, the debate over Mary's perpetual virginity revealed deeper fissures within Christianity about the nature of incarnation itself. If Christ truly became human, sharing fully in human experience, why was it necessary to preserve his mother from the normal experiences of human sexuality and childbirth? The doctrine seemed to suggest that there was something inherently defiling about female reproductive function, something incompatible with holiness. This created a theological paradox. Christianity claimed to honor the human body as God's creation while simultaneously teaching that normal bodily functions somehow diminished spiritual purity. The Virgin Mary became the perfect symbol of this impossible tension, fully human yet untouched by the experiences that define human existence. The early Church Fathers constructed elaborate theological frameworks to resolve these contradictions, but their solutions often raised more questions than they answered. As the debate intensified, it became clear that the stakes involved more than historical accuracy or biblical interpretation. At issue was Christianity's fundamental understanding of sexuality, holiness, and what it meant to be truly human. The manuscript that Father Martinelli discovered in the Vatican archives contained correspondence between early bishops revealing the political machinations behind doctrinal decisions that believers had assumed were divinely inspired. Letters described strategic meetings where church leaders debated not theological truth but public relations, how to present Christian teachings in ways that would attract converts while maintaining institutional authority. One particularly shocking document revealed that several prominent 4th-century bishops privately expressed doubts about perpetual virginity, but publicly supported it because abandoning the doctrine would cause great scandal among the faithful and provide ammunition for pagan critics. These revelations suggested that what millions of Christians accepted as sacred truth might have been carefully calculated institutional policy. The implications were staggering. If church leaders had manipulated doctrine for political purposes regarding Mary's virginity, what other fundamental beliefs might be similarly compromised? As Father Martinelli continued reading by candlelight, he realized he held evidence that could shatter the faith of countless believers or, if suppressed, continue a deception that had lasted nearly 2,000 years. The sacred mystery that had begun with an angel's announcement to a young woman in Nazareth had evolved into something far removed from its humble origins. Mary's simple, yes, to God's invitation had been transformed into a complex theological edifice supporting institutional power, sexual repression, and patriarchal authority. The debate over her perpetual virginity revealed Christianity's ongoing struggle with human sexuality, women's roles, and the relationship between body and spirit. Yet perhaps most troubling was the growing evidence that this central doctrine might have been shaped more by political expediency than divine revelation. As candlelight continued to flicker across ancient parchments in the Vatican's deepest archives, the question remained: would the truth about Mary's virginity ever fully emerge, or would it remain forever buried beneath centuries of institutional investment in a beautiful, powerful, and potentially false teaching that had shaped the faith of billions? The morning of October 31, 1517, changed everything. As Martin Luther's hammer struck the nail that would affix his 95 Theses to the Wittenberg Castle church door, few could have predicted that his challenge to papal authority would resurrect the ancient debate over Mary's perpetual virginity. But Luther, the brilliant Augustinian monk whose biblical scholarship rivaled Jerome's, possessed a dangerous combination: access to original Greek manuscripts and the revolutionary belief that Scripture alone, not church tradition, determined Christian doctrine. Within months of his initial protest against indulgences, Luther began questioning doctrines that had stood unchallenged for over a millennium. His examination of the Virgin Mary's status would prove even more explosive than his attack on papal corruption. In his private study, surrounded by Hebrew and Greek texts, Luther made a discovery that would split Christianity down the middle. The biblical evidence for Mary's perpetual virginity was virtually non-existent. The implications terrified both Catholic authorities and his own supporters, for this wasn't merely academic theology. It threatened the entire structure of Christian worship and authority. Luther's approach to the Mary question revealed the fundamental difference between Protestant and Catholic Christianity. Unlike the early Church Fathers who had relied on tradition, allegory, and philosophical reasoning, Luther demanded scriptural proof for every doctrine. His examination of the Gospel accounts was methodical and devastating. The Greek text clearly stated that Joseph knew her not until she had brought forth her firstborn son, implying normal marital relations afterward. The references to Jesus's brothers and sisters appeared repeatedly throughout the Gospels and Paul's letters, with no indication they were anything other than Mary's biological children. Most damning of all, Luke's Gospel specifically called Jesus Mary's firstborn son, a term that would be meaningless if he were her only child. Luther's linguistic analysis was unassailable, but his conclusions created a crisis that reached beyond theology into the very heart of Christian identity. If Mary had borne other children, if she had experienced normal married life, then the entire edifice of Marian devotion that had developed over 15 centuries was built on false foundations. John Calvin, Luther's intellectual successor, pushed the implications even further with his characteristic logical precision. Writing from Geneva, Calvin argued that the Catholic Church's insistence on Mary's perpetual virginity actually dishonored both Mary and marriage itself. His Institutes of the Christian Religion contained passages that would have been considered blasphemous just decades earlier. It is an insult to the Holy Spirit to think that marriage, which God instituted and blessed, would somehow contaminate the Virgin Mary. Calvin's attack wasn't just theological, it was psychological and social. He recognized that the perpetual virginity doctrine had created impossible standards for Christian women while elevating celibacy above the married state that most believers experienced. His Reformed theology attempted to restore balance by honoring Mary's willing obedience to God while rejecting the supernatural embellishments that had accumulated around her story. But Calvin's rational approach triggered something unexpected: violent reactions from Catholics and Protestants alike. Even believers who agreed with his biblical analysis felt emotionally devastated by the loss of the ethereal, ever-Virgin Mary who had provided comfort and intercession for countless generations. The Catholic Church's response to Protestant challenges revealed how deeply the perpetual virginity doctrine had become embedded in institutional identity. The Council of Trent, convening in 1545, faced an impossible task: defend traditional teachings while addressing legitimate Protestant criticisms. The Council's debates, recorded in meticulous detail, exposed the desperation of Catholic theologians trying to maintain doctrines they privately acknowledged lacked strong biblical support. Cardinal Cervini's private correspondence, discovered centuries later, revealed his anguish. How can we defend what our own scholars doubt? Yet the Council ultimately chose institutional survival over theological honesty. The Tridentan Decree on Mary's perpetual virginity was crafted with careful ambiguity, affirming the doctrine while avoiding specific biblical claims that Protestant scholars had demolished. But the real strategy was psychological rather than theological. The Council recognized that millions of Catholics had built their spiritual lives around devotion to the ever-Virgin Mary. Abandoning the doctrine would cause mass defections and spiritual crisis on an unprecedented scale. Modern biblical scholarship brought even more devastating challenges to traditional Marian doctrines. Archaeological discoveries in Palestine revealed details about first-century Jewish marriage customs that made perpetual virginity virtually impossible within historical context. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in 1947, contained Jewish writings contemporary with the New Testament that used brothers to mean biological siblings, never cousins or step-siblings as Catholic apologists had argued. Carbon dating techniques applied to early Christian manuscripts revealed that texts supporting perpetual virginity appeared centuries after the Gospels, suggesting later theological development rather than apostolic tradition. Most shocking of all, papyrus fragments discovered in Egypt contained previously unknown gospel passages that explicitly referred to Jesus' brothers as Mary's sons. These findings created a crisis in biblical interpretation: either the evidence was fabricated by hostile scholars, or centuries of Christian teaching had been built on foundations that couldn't withstand historical scrutiny. The psychological impact on believing scholars was devastating. Many experienced what they described as spiritual vertigo, watching their faith's foundations shift beneath them. The contemporary divide over Mary's virginity reflects deeper tensions within Christianity about authority, interpretation, and the relationship between faith and evidence. Conservative Catholics maintain unwavering commitment to church teaching, arguing that doctrinal development under Holy Spirit guidance validates beliefs that may lack explicit biblical support. They point to the spiritual fruits of Marian devotion, the countless saints, the miraculous healings at Marian shrines, the comfort provided to suffering believers throughout history. For them, the perpetual virginity isn't just historical claim but lived reality confirmed by centuries of Christian experience. Protestant responses vary dramatically. Some maintain respectful silence about Catholic distinctives, while others launch aggressive apologetic attacks on what they consider unbiblical additions to Christianity. Orthodox Christians occupy middle ground, honoring Mary's perpetual virginity while avoiding the excessive Marian devotion they associate with Roman Catholicism. But perhaps most telling are the surveys revealing that increasing numbers of Catholics privately doubt traditional Marian doctrines while maintaining public conformity. The Internet age has made alternative interpretations widely available, creating cognitive dissonance between official teaching and personal conviction. The psychological impact of the Mary debate extends far beyond academic theology into the daily spiritual lives of millions of believers. Catholic women describe feeling torn between respect for church teaching and their own experiences of sexuality, marriage, and motherhood. They struggle to relate to a Mary whose experiences seem disconnected from normal human existence. Many report feeling guilty for their doubts while simultaneously finding it impossible to believe that sexual intimacy within marriage would somehow diminish Mary's holiness. Protestant women often express relief at being freed from impossible standards of purity while mourning the loss of Mary as intercessor and spiritual mother. Children raised in divided households frequently experience confusion about fundamental Christian beliefs, unsure whether Mary represents achievable holiness or impossible perfection. Clergy across denominational lines report increasing questions about Marian doctrines, with younger generations particularly resistant to teachings they perceive as anti-sexual or anti-feminist. The personal testimonies reveal that the Mary question isn't abstract theology but lived experience affecting millions of believers' understanding of sexuality, holiness, and their own spiritual worth. The suppressed evidence surrounding Mary's perpetual virginity reveals the extent to which institutional interests have shaped doctrinal development throughout Christian history. Vatican archives contain documents from ecumenical councils showing bishops voting on doctrinal questions based on political rather than theological considerations. Letters between medieval popes reveal strategic decisions to emphasize Marian doctrines as ways of distinguishing Catholic Christianity from both Eastern Orthodox and emerging Protestant alternatives. Modern Catholic scholars have privately circulated papers acknowledging the biblical weakness of perpetual virginity claims while arguing for maintaining the doctrine as valuable spiritual metaphor. Most disturbing are the accounts of scholars who faced institutional punishment for publishing research challenging traditional Marian teachings. The pattern suggests that church authorities have long known that certain doctrines lack historical foundation but have chosen to preserve them for institutional and pastoral reasons. This raises profound questions about the relationship between truth and belief, between institutional authority and biblical evidence, between protecting believers' faith and honest scholarship. The documents Father Martinelli discovered were just the tip of an iceberg whose full dimensions remain hidden. The revelation that transformed Father Martinelli's understanding came not from ancient manuscripts but from a contemporary source that connected all the historical dots. Hidden within a routine theological journal published by the Pontifical Biblical Institute, he found an article that changed everything. The author, a respected Catholic biblical scholar, had compiled evidence from multiple sources, archaeological, linguistic, historical, and textual, that definitively demonstrated the late development of perpetual virginity doctrine. More importantly, the scholar had traced the political and social factors that motivated church leaders to emphasize Mary's virginity despite weak biblical support. The article revealed that every major expansion of Marian doctrine coincided with periods of external threat to church authority. Challenges from paganism, Eastern Christianity, Protestant Reformation, modern biblical criticism, and feminist theology. The pattern was unmistakable. Mary's ever-increasing exaltation served institutional rather than theological purposes. Yet the article's conclusion was perhaps most shocking of all. The author argued that abandoning historically questionable doctrines might actually strengthen rather than weaken Christian faith by returning focus to the essential gospel message of divine love expressed through human incarnation. The implications of Father Martinelli's discovery extend beyond denominational boundaries to challenge Christianity's fundamental approach to truth and authority. If the Mary question reveals that church leaders have knowingly maintained questionable doctrines for institutional purposes, what does this mean for other contested teachings? How many beliefs that millions consider essential to Christianity might be historical developments rather than apostolic truth? The questions cascade through every aspect of Christian belief. Biblical interpretation, papal authority, clerical celibacy, sacramental theology, and moral teaching. Yet perhaps the most profound challenge involves the relationship between faith and doubt. If honest examination of evidence undermines traditional beliefs, does faith require intellectual dishonesty? Can Christianity maintain its credibility while preserving teachings that historical scholarship has challenged? The Mary debate forces believers to choose between comfortable certainty and uncomfortable truth, between institutional loyalty and intellectual integrity. As Father Martinelli sat in the Vatican archives, surrounded by centuries of carefully preserved documents, he realized that the question of Mary's perpetual virginity would never be definitively resolved, not because evidence was lacking, but because too many people's spiritual lives depended on maintaining a beautiful, comforting, and quite possibly false teaching. The debate that began with an angel's announcement to a young woman in Nazareth 2,000 years ago continues to divide Christianity because it touches the deepest questions of human existence: the relationship between spirit and flesh, the nature of holiness, and the meaning of truth itself. Mary's perpetual virginity has become more than historical claim; it represents competing visions of Christianity's future. Will the Church embrace honest scholarship even when it challenges beloved traditions? Can faith survive the loss of doctrines that have provided comfort for centuries? Or will institutional preservation triumph over intellectual integrity, maintaining beautiful lies rather than confronting difficult truths? As candlelight flickered across ancient manuscripts in the Vatican's deepest archives, Father Martinelli understood that he held more than historical documents. He possessed evidence of Christianity's ongoing struggle with its own foundations. The debate over Mary's virginity will never truly end because it embodies the eternal tension between what believers want their faith to be and what honest examination reveals it might actually be.